for tuning in to The Third Man, and today me and Jimmy are going to take a look at the Muslim metaphysician's video on why the Trinity is not necessary. So the Muslim metaphysician posted this video critiquing, a common Trinitarian argument regarding whether the Trinity is necessary at all. Obviously, as a Muslim, you already know he's not going to affirm that it is. And you had some comments on the notion or his distinction between the idea of possession and expression of an attribute.
The fundamental assumption is that a character trait or attribute cannot be had unless it's expressed. And the question is, why is that the case? Why should we buy into this? So first of all, the Trinitarian needs to provide an argument or justification for actually demonstrating that a character trait or attribute must actually be expressed in order to be possessed. So I'm going to make a distinction between possessing an attribute and expressing an attribute.
Can you explain to me in a way, that a bondman can understand that it undermans society?
Yes. So I think it's useful to start with his analogy.
So we can think of and this is just a thought experiment, of a person existing alone by themselves on an island. Let's say that there's other humans that exist, but this person happening, and I'm going to make it extravagant. This person happened to sort of was left on an island alone, and they were able to survive. Maybe they were taken care of by animals, whatever the case is, right? But no other humans no other humans existed on the island, let's just say. Now, would it be fair to say, for example, that this human being, and I'll use myself as an example. Let's say I'm the one who's on the island all alone by myself, right? So I'm on the island all alone by myself and there's no other humans there. Would it be fair to say that Jake couldn't possibly be friendly or loving just because I didn't have the opportunity to express my attribute of being friendly or loving? Well, no. Why should we think that? Why couldn't I possess the attribute of being friendly or loving even if I didn't have another to love? Meaning I could possess the attribute without expressing it. And one way to think of this is conditionally that if other humans were actually introduced to the island, if I were to act friendly to them or express a friendly nature and loving nature to them, if they were to actually be introduced to the island and I was able to have the ability to express that attribute, and given that opportunity that I actually would, then it doesn't seem at all inconceivable to me to say that Jake could be friendly or loving because I possess the attribute, even if I don't yet have the ability to express the attribute with other persons or other humans.
He uses this analogy of a person who's on an island. And this person who's on an island, we can imagine, might have the ability to love people. We might even, watch this person on the island. We see their daily life, the way they act. Maybe there's some critters on the island and they interact with the critters. And, we think, oh, this seems kind of like a nice guy. This is the kind of person who would love people were they to show up on his island. And so we garner that idea of how he might express himself if there were other people to express himself to. By extension of the analogy, there is a problem. In the analogy, the reason why we can make this distinction between his possession of a certain trait, like loveliness or being loving or having the potential to love, for example, versus the expression of a trait, like actually instituting that kind of relationship with another person, actually meeting another person and making legway and earning their trust and demonstrating kindness and charity to this person, et cetera, all the things that go into a friendship and so forth. The reason we can make that distinction and the analogy is that we can distinguish what's on the island from what's not on the island. We can imagine, out there in the world, there are people. And any one of them may travel to the island one day and meet this person. You know, it might be fairly unlikely given however this analogy is contextualized. Maybe we imagine that this is the first person on this imaginary island world. And so there aren't any other people yet. But then probably we still have some way of thinking that people may come about. You know, perhaps there is a God who can create people and put them on this island. And so the distinction between the possession of lovingness and the expression of lovingness is still makeable. We can still make that distinction because we have this point of reference in another person, right? So this is not a very good analogy because of two reasons. Number one, for a Unitarian God like Allah, if we're to make this distinction, like in the analogy, between those traits he possesses and the ones he expresses, we have to ask, in virtue of what does that distinction hold? In virtue of what is Allah definable this way? What makes Allah's love merely potential in himself and yet expressed in creation? Why? Well, there really are only two answers that the Muslim can give that will explain how Allah can have this distinct, merely potential or unexpressed love in himself and expressed love in creation. One is to say that there's something like Platonic forms. There are these abstracta that are independent of Allah and yet which define Allah. There are these metaphysical entities independent of Allah on which he is contingent, to which he is subject. And in virtue of these things, he is defined as a being who is merely unexpressing of love, not yet expressing it, right? You can almost think of this distinction between possession of love and expression of love as a sort of rule in a game, right? Allah is then kind of like a character in this game, and this rule tells us how the game is to be played. If Allah wants to play by the rules, if he wants to be an existent character, then he has to follow this rule in the game, and by following it, he can then express his love in creation. But then Allah is not self-existent. He is not sufficient for his own existence. He depends on things like metaphysical game rules. He depends on things like Platonic forms or whatever this abstract object really is. I mean, there are other ways to think of this independent entity. Maybe it is a god, for example. And of course, the Muslim is going to deny that outright. But a potential way to explain how Allah could be distinctly, unexpressively loving is that, well, there's this other God who already has love, and Allah can be distinguished from that God. You know, Allah is like the man on the island, and the real God is out here. Oh, you know, I can add people to the island, and so, Allah can be joined by other people on the island, and that explains how he'll come to be expressing the love that he merely possessed as potential before. But, that's problematic because now you've got this higher entity than Allah defining him. So hopefully that's obvious why that's problematic, right? We don't want to undermine Allah's aseity, but that's exactly what our only alternative does. The other way that we can distinguish Allah's merely possessed love versus his expressed love is to say that we're making that distinction from the reference point of creation. Allah becomes expressive of his love through creation. And so creation then is sort of the metaphysical stage on which Allah truly discovers who he is. As in process theology, his being blossoms. He comes to be who he was in mere potential before. This not only undermines God's aseity because he now depends on creation for this distinction, but it also challenges God's immutability. God seems to change from merely potentially loving to actually loving. That's going to be bad for any Muslim who wants to say that Allah is pure act. So this is a very big problem, and this is only touching the surface of why this distinction is not good. But earlier as I was approaching this, I said there were two problems with his analogy. So this has been the first problem, right? The first problem is, well, there's not really a way to make that analogy work for Islam. The only ways to make it work are if you're going to be a Platonist or if you're going to be a process theologian, and neither of those are consistent with Orthodox Muslim theology. The other reason it's a problem is precisely because the only good way, the only theoretically legitimate way to distinguish a person as having merely possessed or unexpressed love versus a person who has expressed that love is that you need to distinguish that in terms of another person. That is, the way to distinguish a person's lovingness or hatefulness, mercy, charity, justice, these are all personal distinctions that can only be understood further in terms of persons. So, for example, if I want to say that someone is potentially merciful, but they've never had an occasion to be merciful because they've never run into another person, notice right there, I had to appeal to the concept of another person. I need other person. I need other self, other I. The I-you relationship is definitive to distinguishing things like unexpressed versus expressed love. So the irony here of Muslim metaphysicians' analogy is that it's not good, and the only way in which it could be good, per Impossibility, is that it's Trinitarian. When we take God to be I-you inclusive, when we take God to be a God who is multi-personal and not Unitarian, then we have a standard by which to begin to say God is potentially relational in this way. But if we want to say God is potentially relational and there are no other persons, there simply is no ground for that distinction. In order to satisfy the conceptual needs for that distinction, I need the concept of another person, and there just is no such thing for a Unitarian God prior to creation, at least not for Allah, who's neither a process theology deity, nor is he part of a Platonic realm. So that I don't think that covers all that has to do with this topic, and I didn't go over all of Muslim metaphysicians' points, but just dealing with the analogy that he uses and the distinction he makes between character possession or trait possession versus trait expression. Number one, again, that's a problem for Allah's aseity. Muslim metaphysician will either have to be a Platonist or a process theologian to get around that problem, and that doesn't work for his Islamic theology. Two, the only forthcoming ground for that distinction is a personal ground, and only Trinitarians have access to that kind of metaphysical resource to make such distinctions.
Yeah, it seems like the lack of a multi-personal God it doesn't apply just to Islam, but any Unitarian group is going to be the central problem. And obviously most of the arguments we're going to present.
Yeah, take for example, take a different trait, for example. I think we focus on love because, we want to get right to the meat and we don't want to have to explain how other concepts relate to love. But if we want to show how integrated love is in our concept of God, John says that God is love. Then we begin to see that really that is a interdependent trait of God. That is, because God's attributes entail each other, one cannot have the traditional perfections of God without having his love, and further that we cannot have his love, as you said, without the multi-personality of God, the triunity of God. So, for example, in order for God to have self-knowledge, he needs to be able to distinguish himself from what he is not. He needs to have a concept of self, but implicit in the concept of self, again, is a notion of other. I need to be able to distinguish myself. But what is Allah going to distinguish himself from? He's a Unitarian being, so his person will just have to be whatever it is. We seem to be without.
Yeah, there's no abstract nothing or some kind of other thing to contrast himself from.
Precisely. Well, it seems that self-identification is itself contrastive. So unless the Muslim wants to come up with a bizarre psychology of deity, we're going to have a problem here. But the Trinitarian doesn't suffer that problem because in the Trinity, God's self-knowledge is part of his knowing the Son, the Father knowing the Son through the personal context of the Spirit if one can imagine two people having a conversation in the context of a third person, of course, all analogies are going to fail. These are humans, right? But the idea there obviously is that there is a transaction of knowledge between two persons. They are able to distinguish each other in light of a third personal context. So there is never at any instance some kind of, like you said, abstract nothingness or, Tolkien-esque void in which God resides, as if he were, just this hovering light bulb in the darkness or something like that, right? It seems like the problem for Allah is that God doesn't even have nothing from which to distinguish himself. There's nothing from which to have contrastive self-identification. And Trinitarians don't struggle with that problem. So you can see there that there's kind of an overlap of God's omniscience and God's love with, you might be able to raise problems. I think maybe it's a little more obvious how you could raise problems for God's lovingness if he's not omniscient. How can an all-wise being know how to love others if he's not all-knowing? But it goes the other way too, right? If a being is not loving, if a being is not essentially interpersonal, then it seems like they don't even have the right kind of conceptual tools to distinguish themselves. Really quick, I just want to say a lot of that is using analogous language and theology. We don't mean to reduce God to human psychology, but we also want to appreciate the fact that God himself, whether you're a Muslim or a Christian, in his holy scriptures, uses human psychology, human properties, human concepts, so on and so forth, to describe himself, and so help us build a theology of who he is based off of analogies to these things. So hopefully it's not being seen that I'm reducing God to human psychology, but I'm actually using the same theological tools to construct my vision of God that Muslims formally agree with, I think.
It's basically maintaining analogical predication, and there is no univocal things going on here, which is, a classical theist like a Muslim's gonna also somewhat maintain, at least usually from my understanding.
Let me try one last thing. I think it kind of relates to a vacuity problem that plagues a lot of metaphysical systems that try to attend to big unifying concepts, whether it be a god or Plotinus is one, or Hindu Brahman, or Nagarjuna's like emptiness. Like these are very big picture meta narrative type entities or ideas that are meant to sort of explain everything. They're just meant to put every bit of our experience, every belief we have, all of our living choices that we're going through into its place, so we know what's going on. The problem is that when we do that, oftentimes the thing that is meant to unify all of our experience becomes vacuous. So like in Platonism, this kind of problem realizes itself in the non-particularity of the forms. If I say that everything in the universe is some kind of imperfect copy and in fact mimicking overlap of different forms, it's not only just a copy of the forms, but it's like a object that tries to copy many of the forms at once, as it were, intersections of their reflections. Then we can ask the question, well, what are these forms exactly? How, if we think of, I always go to John Frame's example of a tree. If we think of the form of a tree, how many branches does it have? Is its bark more brownish, more gray? Is it darker or lighter? What does it smell like? Does it move in the breeze? Is it sort of flexible, like most trees are? But none of these questions are sensible of a form, right? A form can't have properties like being green or having roots or even growing bark or anything like this. There's nothing tree-like about it. It has no resemblance to a tree. In what sense, then, is it the form of a tree? How do we have the epistemic right to identify this form as of tree whatsoever? It seems like we're not talking about something that's like anything. This is something that's like nothing. It's something in pure abstract. By which I mean the only thing about which you can say, because it's all that it is something. But of course, you can't even say that, because however you make sense of being something is of it being a particular thing in terms of some other explanatory principle, right? So that's the problem of vacuity exemplified by Platonism, it pops up in a bunch of other systems. For God, sometimes it's brought up as like a moral problem related to the Euthyphro. So like, if God is goodness, if God is thought to be the very thing, the very defining element of goodness, then what then does it mean to say God is good? Right? Goodness is good. Okay, but like, what does that mean, right? To the extent that something is good, if God is goodness, just really means that it has properties that make it godlike, right? But then that means when we say God is good, which is to say goodness is good, that's to say God is godlike. But that's just tautological, right? It doesn't express anything necessarily significant. So, I mean, and there are other comeback objections, like, well, not all truisms are trivial. Maybe so, but the real issue here is that you've got a running vacuity problem. You've got this problem that plagues big picture concepts. So I think that kind of pops up here with trying to have Allah possess omniscience sans Trinitarian love. If Allah is to know himself, he must know himself as a particular thing, not just as a general thing. There must be some way in which he has a distinguishing or contrastive feature. He is Allah, not blah, right? So, but that's problematic because there's nothing from which, there's nothing out there that Allah can contrast himself from. The sort of knowledge that Allah would have is just that he is himself. Well, what is himself? Well, it's just himself. There's no further information that can be added. So, what is that knowledge? Nothing really, right? There's nothing to be said of it. Even to say that it's himself is already too particular because, of course, again, just as when we were thinking of something, when we think of him, his self, we are thinking of a particular person that can be contrasted from other things. Now, if you're a Trinitarian, when God thinks of himself, he thinks of himself triunely. And so the Father is able to conceive of himself as Father in relation to the Son through the Spirit. When the Spirit thinks of the Father, he is able to think of himself as the Father in relation to he's able to think of himself as the Spirit in relation to the Father through the Son, right? So there is always an ability to have a unifying concept. We are all God. We are one God, not just multiple gods, not we have multiple examples of aseity. We all possess the one same aseity. But at the same time, the Son can distinguish himself from the Father, Spirit, and so on and so forth at all, right?
I have one further question in regards to this. It's a distinction that a Muslim metaphysician uses commonly in his arguments. It's the is of predication and the is of identity. So you mentioned the Father, Son, and Spirit, and there's often a common argument if the Father is God, the Son is God, and the Spirit is God, then, they're all identical. Or we can't really explain what we mean when we say that they are, or the Father is God. We can't really explain what that is means there. So what's your thoughts about that, given what you just said?
Yeah, you're referring to an issue that's it's more like a far-off cousin topic, but it seems to me that a lot is taken for granted there among some philosophers, that there's a obvious and tremendous distinction between these two things. But it seems to me that, like, at best, it's not terribly clear what their relationship is. And furthermore, upon investigation, it seems like it's just a genus-species relationship. Like, one can conceive or think about or speak or write about the is of identity in terms of an is of predication. One can say one has the property of being oneself or something like that, right? So you might want to raise problems for a propertarian metaphysic. That is, you might want to raise problems for certain theories of properties, but I don't think that's going to do harm to the language or the nature of thinking that way, because you can always explain properties in different ways, and presumably at least one of those ways makes sense of speaking of the identity is in terms of predication. And it seems to me that you can go the other way around too, that to have a predicate, to possess a certain property, is to have a certain identity. It's to be the one who has that property. So it just seems to me that maybe one of these is more fundamental. Like perhaps what one's identity is some kind of exhaustive concept that only God can have. This is just me conjecturing at this point. I'm not actually putting this forward, but perhaps only God has some kind of exhaustive concept of your identity, and humans are then able to approximate that identity with certain predicates that are more fundamental, universal, lasting, enduring, in terms of time and the change that we go through. And we use those as proximate names for a person. We use these as ways to classify a person in terms of his identity, when really those are just very important predicates. That's just conjecture, but that's just a way of raising the issue when we get to the Trinity of what we thought to be this grand distinction between the is of identity and the is of predicate. I don't know. I'm not sure it's really that big a distinction. Maybe these things are a lot more mysterious than we think they are. And a lot of these problems are more about how we talk about what's going on than really is the things about which we are talking. This has a lot to do maybe more with how we think and conceptualize things like the Trinity than with the Trinity itself. I'm not sure that the Trinity, for example, plays the game, so to speak, of being subject to our concepts of identity and is of predication so clearly and so straightforwardly. Perhaps that's an area where philosophers have been too presumptuous.
And we can think of it as a parody argument. So it's an argument to show that we can take an attribute that they believe in and show that it leads to a conclusion which they don't accept. So premise 1, necessarily God is perfectly loving. Would the Christian agree with that? Well, yes, they would. Premise 2 is going to mirror exactly the same argument that they put, except we're just going to input the word forgiving instead of loving. And we would agree with premise 1 as well. Premise 2, necessarily being perfectly forgiving entails actually forgiving another. Premise 3, necessarily any other God forgives either within God or as part of God's creation. Premise 4, necessarily God was free not to create. Premise 5, necessarily this one who is forgiven isn't part of God's creation. Premise 6, therefore necessarily God must have another within him to forgive. And premise 7, therefore necessarily someone within God has done something requiring forgiveness. So this results, notice it's a parody argument that when we insert the word forgiving, which is a character trait, and which they're going to agree with premise 1, but what they may want to attack is premise 2. Necessarily being perfectly forgiving entails actually forgiving another. If they want to say that this is false, then what that entails or implies is that they don't believe that a character trait such as forgiveness necessarily, in order to possess it, that it necessarily entails the expression of it. So if they want to deny premise 2, then I will have the same ability to deny premise 2 when they state that necessarily being perfectly loving entails actually loving another. So I'm pointing out their inconsistency with their own claims.
So I'll say a few words about this parody argument and whether I think it's successful or not. I don't think that it is. So the parody argument basically says, look, Trinitarians are being inconsistent. There's attributes they'll say that need to be expressed, but rather they do not in order to be possessed. So take the attribute of being forgiving. Well, being forgiving implies moral failure. So if we say that, we're going to have to say there's moral failure in the Trinity. And that's something most Trinitarians don't want to say, and neither do I. So what are we actually going to say? Well, we're probably going to say in response that forgiveness and sort of things like that are not essential properties of God. Rather, they're economic properties of God that are expressing or reflexive of the social reality that's already in God. And this way preserves both the idea that God doesn't have any moral failures in the immanent Trinity, and explains why we see forgiveness from God in the economic Trinity. And I think that perfectly explains it, so I don't think this is any knockdown argument, and I don't think it undermines the point about love, because forgiveness is a different kind of attribute than love. One's essential to the immanent Trinity. As one of my friends once said, God's graciousness is an attribute of the economic Trinity, i.e. the Trinity in redemptive history, and thus not essential in the same sense as his justice. Lastly, I want to share just this one argument. It's an interesting argument. I'm borrowing it from Jimmy, so all credit goes to him. But I want to set some background context for it so that there's no confusion on why we posit this part. So, suppose reality was kind of like one of those statues that are kind of abstract and hard to understand, and you can walk away with having different interpretations of it. Some people view reality just like that you can have a bunch of different interpretations of it, and we're really not in a position which to say is correct. But you can also go to the person who makes the piece of art and ask them, hey, what's this art mean? What is the meaning behind these structures and so forth, or whatever the art is? And this is kind of how presuppositionalists and Christians kind of view reality. We kind of sort of have the author's knowledge about it, and he can tell us what it is. So there is no confusion. It's not left to just a bunch of competing interpretations from secondary sources. Well, the problem with Islam and Unitarianism in general is that it may threaten that connection we have with God. There may not be any grounds for that there in their religions. This sort of thinking God's thoughts after him notion that a lot of Vantillians present seems to be threatened by Unitarian theology. And I wish to go into this argument now. Why? So this is all from Jimmy, so kudos to him once again. Thank you for sharing this with me. If God is unipersonal, then the knowledge he has is unipersonal. But then his mode and content of knowledge has no metaphysical properties related to perspectival knowledge. It's not multi-personal. So then, there is no ground for God to convey his knowledge. He is, in a weird sense, a solipsis. Now, some may object and say to that, and Jimmy shares this objection in response to it, that, Trinitarians kind of say that we don't share completely a divine perspective. You'd have to be one of the Trinitarian persons yourself to completely have that same perspective. So, since we don't have God's eye view of things, therefore, this is no challenge to a Muslim who's going to also say we don't have a God's eye view of things. But I want to quote Jimmy once again, because he thinks there's a Trinitarian answer to such a quandary. The difference, I think, is that in the Trinitarian story, God is completely personal, and so there is no genuinely new metaphysical category. There are only covenantal reflections of God. On the Unitarian view, to have knowledge unlike God's is not to reflect God at all. There's no metaphysical archetype for it. It's a random category of stuff in your ontology. If you and I have shareable knowledge, that gives us a human impression of God's shared knowledge, the knowledge the members share. If you and I have shareable knowledge on Islam, there's no precedent in God whatsoever. What you said follows as a result. For God's knowledge to have the property of communicability, creatures or Platonic laws must define it. So that's an argument I wanted to share. Thank you for tuning in. Like, share, subscribe. Alright, you guys have a good night. Come back again.